The mud on Cougar Creek Road had been churned to grease by Tuesday morning, and by Thursday, it was axle deep in 4 places, and the $400,000 Peterbilt log skidder, belonging to Cascade Timber Solutions, was buried to its belly pan in the 3rd one, pulling a loaded self-loader trailer that nobody on that crew could move, free, or account for on any timeline that the mill foreman back in Darrington was willing to accept. The self-loader was carrying 11 old-growth cedar logs, each one 8 to 9 feet across at the butt, each one cut that same morning from the north slope above the Sauk River drainage. The combined load weighed somewhere around 190,000 pounds. The trailer's rear axle had broken through a culvert that had been weakened by 3 weeks of February rain, and the whole rig had pivoted and settled into the soft fill on a roadside slope at a 22-degree angle. The Peterbilt's rear drive axles spinning free in the black mud. The trailer's load shifting and groaning as the ground beneath it continued to soften. Arlo Macklin, the crew foreman for Cascade Timber, had 2 options in his mind and 1 phone in his hand. He called the first option. Pacific Northwest Heavy Recovery out of Marysville arrived with a 2021 Rotator RFD-60, a machine that cost $418,000 off the floor and another $80,000 in rigging by the time Pacific NW had its spec for timber country work. The operator walked the scene for 20 minutes, measured the slope angle with a digital inclinometer, studied the culvert collapse underneath the trailer's rear axle, and came back to Arlo with a number. 14 hours, minimum. Maybe 2 days if the ground kept softening. He wasn't willing to anchor on the upslope side because the fill under the anchor points was compromised. He wasn't willing to work below the trailer because of the load shift risk on that 22-degree angle. He needed to call in a second unit from the Marysville yard and set a tandem pull, and the second unit wouldn't be available until the following morning. Arlo looked at the load. 11 old-growth cedar logs. The mill was expecting them Friday. The contract penalty for a late delivery was $4,200 per day. Make the call for the second unit, Arlo said, and tell them to be here by 6. The Pacific NW operator went back to his cab. The second crew member, a young guy named Bryce who'd been on timber recoveries for 2 years, walked around the trailer a second time with his hands in his jacket pockets and said to nobody in particular, even with 2 units, that slope angle is going to be a problem. That load wants to roll. If you appreciate stories about old iron and the men who keep it running, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read everyone. That was when Harlan Voss showed up. He came up Cougar Creek Road in his pickup truck, a 94 F250 with a cracked windshield and a CB antenna zip tied to the mirror bracket, and he parked 200 feet back from the scene the way a man does when he's been around working equipment long enough to know you don't crowd a recovery. He sat in the cab for a minute. Then he got out and walked down the road toward the crew. Harlan was 73 years old. He had worked timber in Skagit County for 51 years, starting at age 17 as a choker setter on the clear cuts above concrete. Washington, moving to rigging slinger by 22, to hook tender by 30, and spending the last 22 years of his career as a private timber recovery contractor, the kind of man you called when a skidder went off a road, when a yarder boom came down wrong, when a full-loaded trailer went into a ditch in country where the road itself was trying to quit. He'd done that work with a 1948 Kenworth 516 that his father had bought new from the Kenworth dealer in Seattle in the spring of 1948 and that Harlan had inherited when his father died in 1979. The Kenworth had been rigged originally as a logging truck, then converted by Harlan's father in the early 1960s with a Holmes 600 recovery boom and a worm drive winch that could spool 250 feet of 3/4-inch cable at a sustained tension that the Holmes specification sheet rated at 65,000 pounds. Harlan had maintained that truck the way his father had taught him, which was the way timber country demanded, completely, without shortcuts, and always before the job rather than after. He had rebuilt the straight 6 engine twice. He had replaced the winch cable 3 times. He had fabricated new outrigger pads from 3-inch steel plate in 1994 when the originals cracked, and he had re-welded the boom base in 2001 when a hard pull on a buried Cat D8 had stressed the original welds past what he was comfortable with. The truck had not worked a commercial job since 2009, when Harlan had retired from contracting at age 60. Since then, it had sat in his equipment barn outside Rockport, started once a month, driven down his driveway and back, maintained the way old timbermen maintain things that cost them sweat to build and would cost someone else more than sweat to replace. Harlan's wife, Ruth, had died in 2017. His son lived in Bellingham and came up on holidays. The scanner in Harlan's kitchen had been running every day for 53 years, and on Thursday morning in February of 2023, it told him what was happening on Cougar Creek Road. And Harlan knew that road the way he knew the back of his hand, had worked 3 recoveries on it in the 1980s and 1990s, knew where the culverts were and what they were built on and how they behaved when the fill got saturated. He also knew something else. The culvert that had failed under that trailer's rear axle sat at the bottom of a fill section where the road had been built over a dry creek bed in 1961. He had worked that road during its first year of use. He knew the geometry of what was underneath it the way the Pacific NW operator with his digital inclinometer could not know it, because knowing it required being there when the road was made. Arlo Macklin saw the old man walking down toward the scene and stepped out to meet him. "Private property," Arlo said. "Active recovery operation." "I know it," Harlan said. "I'm Harlan Voss. I did timber recovery in this county for 30 years. Heard your call on the scanner. We've got a recovery crew." "I can see that." Harlan looked at the Pacific NW rotator, at the Peterbilt sunk in the mud, at the trailer and its load of cedar. He was quiet for a moment. "That culvert that let go," Harlan said. 1961 install, dry creek bed fill. The void under it runs about 14 feet north to south. Your anchor points on the upslope side are sitting over the edge of that void. Arlo looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because I was on this road when it was built." The Pacific NW operator had walked over during this exchange. He was 38 years old and had been doing heavy recovery for 11 years. He looked at Harlan with the expression of a professional who has learned to categorize the people who show up at his job sites. "Sir, this is a technical recovery. We've assessed the anchor points. We've got a second unit coming in the morning. Your anchor points are over a 14-foot void," Harlan said. "That second unit puts load on them. You'll have a rotator in the ditch alongside the trailer. We're using ground-penetrating assessment before we anchor. You got a GPR unit on that truck?" The operator paused. "We'll probe the ground manually." Harlan nodded once. He looked at the load of cedar. He looked at the slope angle. He looked at the road surface north of the buried culvert. Then he turned and walked back toward his pickup. Arlo called after him. "Where are you going?" "To get my truck," Harlan said without stopping. He was gone 40 minutes. Long enough for Arlo Macklin to make 2 phone calls to the mill in Darrington. Long enough for the Pacific NW operator to probe 6 anchor points on the upslope side and mark 3 of them with orange flags as compromised. Long enough for Bryce to take 17 photographs of the trailer's load shift for the insurance file, and long enough for the mud under the Peterbilt's drive axles to creep another 2 inches down the slope. The operator found a void on his 3rd probe. 14 feet, running north to south, exactly where the old man had said it would be. He stood over the probe rod, with his hand still on the handle, and looked at the upslope bank for a moment without saying anything. Then he pulled the rod and went back to his cab to call the Marysville yard. Arlo was standing at the rear of the trailer when he heard the Kenworth before he saw it. That engine note was not something you forgot if you'd grown up around timber equipment. A straight 6 with a long stroke and a low idle, the kind of sound that old logging trucks made when they were loaded and moving through mountain grades, a sound that most men in the timber industry under the age of 50 had never heard in person because the trucks that made it had mostly been scrapped or parked by the time those men came into the industry. The 1948 Kenworth 516 came up Cougar Creek Road at 18 miles per hour, its Holmes 600 boom riding high over the cab, the worm drive winch drum visible behind the cab on the right side, the whole truck painted in faded green and cream, the original Kenworth colors from the late 1940s worn thin enough in places to show the primer coat underneath. The cab was narrow by modern standards. The hood was long. The headlights were round. Hand-lettered on the door in plain white block letters. Voss Timber Recovery, Rockport, Washington. Bryce stopped taking photographs. One of the 2 choker setters on Arlo's crew, a man in his late 20s named Cole who had been sitting on a stump eating his sandwich, stood up. The Pacific NW operator stepped out of his cab and watched the Kenworth park. Nobody said anything for a moment. Arlo walked over. That thing road legal. Licensed and insured, Harlan said, climbing down from the cab with the deliberate care of a man whose knees had decades of steep ground in them. I renew it every year. It's 75 years old. 76 in April. Kenworth built it right. Harlan walked to the front of his truck and stood looking at the scene the way he'd been looking at it since he arrived the first time, not at the equipment at the ground, at the slope, at where the water was moving under the road surface, at the angle of the trailer against the angle of the fill. The Pacific NW operator walked over. He had recovered his professional composure. "I found your void," he said. 14 feet, running right under our primary anchor zone. "I know. That changes our approach. We're going to need to set anchors further north and work with a longer cable run. That's going to reduce our effective pull force significantly." "What's your sustained tension at that cable length?" The operator gave him a number. Harlan looked at the trailer. "That load's sitting on a slope that's still moving. Every hour you wait, the trailer settles further. By morning, your sustained tension at that cable length won't be enough to overcome the static friction on that load." The operator was quiet. "What's your rig rated at?" he said, looking at the Kenworth. 65,000 pounds sustained on the worm drive, Harlan said. "Less than your rotator." "Yes, but I'm not anchoring on that fill. I'm pulling from the road surface north of the void, and I know where the road surface north of that void is solid, because I watched them build it." He walked toward the buried culvert and pointed. 30 feet north of that culvert, the road bed transitions from fill to cut. Native ground. You can anchor a battleship there. The operator looked where he was pointing. He looked at his own truck. He looked at the Kenworth. Then he said the thing that operators say when they've been beaten on a site assessment by someone with no equipment newer than 1965. "Your call, sir," he said to Arlo. "I'm still recommending we wait for the second unit." "How long?" 6 a.m. tomorrow, earliest." Arlo looked at the trailer, looked at the slope angle, looked at the old man in the feed store cap standing next to a truck that had been built the year Harry Truman was elected. "Harlan," he said, "what do you need from my crew? If you're hooked on this story, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. These old iron stories don't show up on the algorithm easily, and your support is what keeps them coming. Thank you." Harlan needed 3 things. He needed 2 of Arlo's choker setters to help run his cable under the trailer frame at a specific angle he marked with a piece of chalk on the trailer's crossmember. He needed the Peterbilt's operator to be in the cab and ready to give the drive axles just enough throttle to break the mud seal without spinning. And he needed everyone else 20 feet back from the trailer on the uphill side, because when the load shifted on that slope, it was going to shift fast, and it was going to shift toward the low side, and he didn't want anyone standing in the low side's path. Cole, the choker setter who'd been eating the sandwich, went under the trailer with Harlan's cable without being asked twice. He was 28 years old and had grown up in Darrington listening to his grandfather talk about the old growth days. He didn't know what he was looking at exactly when he looked at the Kenworth, but he knew it was something his grandfather would have recognized. He ran the cable where Harlan told him to run it, and he ran it right. Harlan positioned the Kenworth 33 feet north of the failed culvert on the road surface that had been cut from native ground in 1961. He set his outrigger pads, the 3-inch steel plate pads he'd fabricated himself in 1994, on that ground and watched them settle without movement. He ran his snatch block off the anchor he'd set on a Douglas fir on the upslope side, a tree that had been growing in that ground since before the road existed. He walked the cable line twice, checking the angle, checking the block, checking the load path. He didn't rush. Bryce was filming on his phone. He'd been filming since the Kenworth arrived. The Pacific NW operator sat in his rotator cab. He was a professional, and he was watching a professional work, and he understood what he was seeing even if he wasn't happy about where he was sitting. The Kenworth's rig angle was something his rotator couldn't match on this road in this terrain. The worm drive on that Holmes boom allowed a sustained low pull at an angle that kept the load from rolling toward the low side during extraction. His rotator's hydraulic winch was faster and more powerful in absolute terms. But on this particular slope, with this particular load, at this particular angle, the older machine's geometry was better suited than his. He didn't say that out loud, but he watched. Harlan climbed into the Kenworth's cab. The engine was still running, that long low idle that hadn't changed since 1948. He looked at his gauges, oil pressure, temperature, the winch tension indicator he'd added in 1987, a simple mechanical dial that read in 5,000-pound increments. He checked his mirrors. He looked at the Peterbilt's cab and raised one hand. The Peterbilt operator raised his hand back. Harlan engaged the power takeoff. The Holmes 600 boom took the load. The cable went taut. The Kenworth's frame settled onto the outrigger pads as the tension rose, and the whole truck's weight transferred from the tires to the steel plate sitting on solid ground that had been solid since before any of the men on that road were born. For the first 30 seconds, nothing visible happened to the trailer. The winch tension indicator climbed past 20,000, past 30,000, touched 45,000, and held. The Kenworth's engine note changed. Not struggling, just working the way a straight six with a long stroke works when it's doing what it was built to do. Harlan held the tension steady. He didn't give more throttle. He let the cable and the geometry and the physics do what 50 years of experience told him they would do if he was patient. The trailer moved. Not a lurch, a slow rotation, the rear end rising as the load redistributed, the buried axle pulling free of the culvert collapse 1 inch at a time. Cole, still standing at the edge of the cleared zone, watched the cedar log shift and resettle on the trailer bunk and said nothing. Arlo stood with his arms crossed and his eyes on the trailer. The Peterbilt operator felt the traction change under his drive axles and gave just enough throttle to keep from spinning in the big truck's rear and came up out of the mud with a sound like a boot being pulled from deep clay. 22 minutes after Harlan engaged the PTO, the trailer's rear axle was on solid ground north of the void. 38 minutes after that, the entire rig, Peterbilt and loaded self-loader both, was clear of the failure zone and sitting on solid road surface, the load of cedar intact, the trailer axles intact, the Peterbilt's drivetrain intact. Harlan shut down the winch. He climbed out of the cab and began pulling his cable back, coiling it the way his father had taught him, hand over hand, a loop at a time, no tangles, no shortcuts. Cole walked over and picked up the far end of the cable and helped feed it onto the drum without being asked. Harlan looked at him once and nodded. Arlo walked over while Harlan was unrigging the snatch block from the fir tree. "What do I owe you?" Harlan kept working. "What did the Pacific NW crew charge you for the site assessment?" $1,800. "Give them their $1,800. They did the work." "Harlan, my diesel and my time." Arlo pulled out his phone. "I'm not going to lowball you. What's your day rate?" Harlan straightened up from a block and looked at Arlo directly for the first time since the recovery. "I don't have a day rate. I'm retired." He picked up the block and carried it back to the Kenworth. The Pacific NW operator pulled his Rotator out of Cougar Creek Road at 2:40 in the afternoon. He didn't say much before he left. He shook Arlo's hand, nodded once in Harlan's direction, and drove back down the mountain. Bryce, the younger crew member, stopped at the Kenworth on his way to the passenger door and looked at the Holmes 600 boom for a long moment. "That's a real Holmes 600, he said. "Yes, it is," Harlan said. Bryce nodded slowly, like a man filing something away. Then he got in the truck and they left. Arlo stayed. His crew was resecuring the cedar load on the self-loader, and he stood near the Kenworth watching Harlan finish coiling the last of his rigging chain. "My grandfather worked timber up on the Suiattle," Arlo said. He talked about the old Kenworth rigs. Said they'd pull anything. "They would," Harlan said, "if you knew how to ask them." He also said the men who ran them didn't get enough credit. Harlan set the last length of chain in the bed box and closed the lid. "Your grandfather was right about that, too." Arlo tried twice more on the payment. Harlan wouldn't take it. What he would take was a handshake and Arlo's word that if the mill in Darrington ever asked who cleared Cougar Creek Road on a Thursday in February, Arlo would tell them the truth. Arlo gave him both. Cole, the choker setter who'd run the cable under the trailer, was waiting at the edge of the road when Harlan walked back to the Kenworth cab. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I want to ask you something." Harlan stopped. "My grandfather had a photograph," Cole said. "Old Kenworth logging truck, rigged out with a boom, working a slide job somewhere above Darrington." He said the operator was the best timber recovery man in Skagit County. Never caught the man's name. Harlan looked at him. "What year was the photograph?" He thought around 1974, maybe 1975. That slide job above Darrington in 1974, that was the Illibot Creek job. Culvert blowout took out 60 feet of road and buried a Cat D7 and 2 loaded trucks. Took 4 days to clear. He paused. I was the only contractor who'd go in there after the second day. Ground was still moving. Cole was quiet for a moment. That was you. That was me in this truck, Harlan said. He climbed into the cab. Tell your grandfather the Kenworth's still running. Cole stepped back and watched the 1948 Kenworth 516 turn around on Cougar Creek Road with the patience of a man who has been turning a long truck on narrow roads for 50 years. Then it headed back down the mountain at 18 miles per hour, the Holmes 600 boom riding high, the straight six turning over with that long, unhurried note, and Cole stood in the road and watched it until it was gone around the first bend. The story moved through Skagit County Timber, circles the way those stories move. Not through press releases, but through morning conversations at the Rockport Diner, through crew change talk at the Darrington Mill Gate, through CB channels the old-timers still monitored. By the following week, it had reached the Kenworth Historical Registry in Seattle, where a man named Doug Halliday, who had been documenting surviving pre-1955 Kenworth trucks for 19 years, drove out to Rockport on a Saturday and knocked on Harlan's equipment barn door. Halliday had a camera and a clipboard and the careful enthusiasm of a man who'd spent 2 decades chasing trucks that no longer existed. He spent 3 hours in that barn. He photographed every panel, every weld, every piece of original equipment. He read the Holmes 600 serial number plate and cross-referenced it against his registry. The boom had been installed at the Seattle dealer in March of 1949. The installation record still existed in archived paperwork Halliday had photographed years earlier without knowing which truck it belonged to. He told Harlan the truck was one of 4 surviving 1948 Kenworth 516ths in the Pacific Northwest and the only one with its original Holmes boom and a documented operational history in timber recovery. He asked if Harlan would bring it to the historical gathering in Snohomish that August. What he thought about mostly was his father. Gerald Voss had driven that truck from the day it left the Seattle dealer in April of 1948 until the morning in October of 1979 when the stroke took him on the kitchen floor of the house outside Rockport. Gerald had worked that truck on every major timber recovery job in Skagit and Whatcom counties for 31 years. He had never advertised. He had never turned down a job because the terrain was bad or the pay was uncertain. He had maintained that engine and that boom with a discipline that Harlan had inherited without fully understanding until he was old enough to understand what it cost. Gerald Voss had died 3 weeks before Harlan's first son was born. He never saw the truck work another job after his stroke. He never saw Harlan take over the contracting work, never saw the Illibot Creek job or the recoveries that followed, never saw the engine rebuilt in 1983. Harlan went to the Snohomish gathering in August. He drove the Kenworth down from Rockport himself at a steady 50 miles per hour, the way his father had driven it on roads that were narrower and not always paved. He parked in the field with the other historical trucks and answered questions for 6 hours. He didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. The Kenworth is still in the equipment barn outside Rockport. Harlan starts it on the 1st of every month and drives it down his driveway and back. The outrigger pads are stacked in the corner. The Holmes 600 boom is greased. The winch cable was replaced in 2019, the 3rd time in the truck's life. Arlo Macklin's crew delivered the cedar load to the Darrington Mill at 6:40 Thursday evening, 4 hours behind schedule. The mill foreman docked them 2 hours of contract time and let the rest go. Arlo told him why they were late. The mill foreman was 61 years old and had grown up in Darrington. He knew the name Voss. He didn't dock the other 2 hours. Cole looked up the Illibot Creek job when he got home that Thursday night. The County Historical Archive had a photograph. An old Kenworth logging truck rigged with a boom, working a slide site above Darrington, dated February 1974. The operator's face wasn't visible, but the truck was, and the door lettering was plain in the black and white image, clear enough to read across 50 years. Voss Timber Recovery, Rockport, Washington. Thank you for staying with this one to the end. If this story meant something to you, Check out the other Iron Witnesses videos on your screen now. There's plenty more old iron with stories to tell. Subscribe if you haven't yet. I'll see you at the next one.